As the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine has now gone into its second month, the American left has produced a number of responses to the situation. Much has been made of both the Russian ruling class's aggression and the American ruling class's geopolitical interests in Eastern Europe, as well as what is the most appropriate means to achieve peace in the war and the region broadly. But this has provoked a number of criticisms and responses. Most of them have been pretty dismissive, but easily the most thoughtful has come from New York Magazine's Eric Levitz in a piece titled "The Left Has Half-Baked Answers on Ukraine." So to go into this, we are now joined by Eric Levitz, as well as Jacobin's own Branko Marcetic. Branko recently wrote a response article titled "What the Left's Critics Ignore About the Military Solutions to Ukraine." So I'm now going to hand it over to Eric, who's going to outline where the article came from, what the main arguments are, and then we'll hear from Branko, and it'll open into a little bit more of a larger discussion. So, Eric.
Sounds good. The impetus for the piece, there's been really sort of a diversity of thought about the Russia-Ukraine conflict within the broad American left. But within a significant portion of the socialist left, and I think the mainstream of DSA, the basic position has been to oppose sending military aid to Ukraine of any kind, and as well as opposing broad-based sanctions on Russia. I'm sympathetic to aspects of this position. I think I broadly, tentatively agree with the position on sanctions, and I tentatively support the arming of Ukraine, and so object there, although my views are a bit unsettled on that. What I was most concerned with in the responses to it was less the positions themselves than what I felt like was the quality of a lot of the argumentation, which I felt like failed to acknowledge or anticipate sort of counter-arguments and objections that I think are very prominent within the discourse and come, I think, pretty readily to mind if one really sort of scrutinizes the question. And I thought that was important, sort of an important failing, in part because the positions that the socialist left is arguing against here are really overwhelmingly popular among Americans. There's broad public support in polls for arming Ukraine and sanctioning Russia. And these positions also have significant traction among the broad liberal left and a lot of people who are potentially, very sympathetic to socialist politics. I know multiple DSA members or people who were DSA members who have left the organization out of alienation from these positions. And so given that climate, I think it's, just for the, to the extent that socialists are going to succeed in persuading the unconverted about this stance on the conflict, and to the extent that they're going to more broadly just sort of build their base, I think it's really important to reason about these questions, really carefully and seriously, and steelman and anticipate sort of what the skeptics' objections are going to be. So what I saw as kind of a key weakness in the arguments was sort of this presentation of seeking a diplomatic resolution to the conflict and providing military aid to Ukraine as sort of self-evidently antithetical positions, and not addressing the objection that, potentially a militarily strong Ukraine might be a precondition in order for a diplomatic resolution to be possible. So in the piece of Branko's that sort of kicked off our back and forth, he wrote that in opposition to sending arms to Ukraine, and argued that peace could only be achieved by a mutually acceptable negotiated settlement that guarantees Ukraine's territorial integrity while addressing Russia's longstanding security concerns. So my primary critique of that piece was that it framed military aid to Ukraine as an alternative to such a settlement without addressing the counter-argument that military aid might be necessary in order to achieve one. And I think that there's some evidence to support that position, even if it's not necessarily dispositive. So we know that at the invasion's outset, Russia declared its interest in conquering, fully demilitarizing Ukraine, dissolving its army, and regime change in Kiev. They had sort of very maximalist military goals that would have completely eroded Ukraine's sovereignty over its territory. And it was the Ukrainian army's unanticipated success, its strength in fending off this much larger Russian force and imposing far more casualties and losses of equipment than the Russian leadership had anticipated, that has led the Kremlin to at least signal right now that it might be amenable to a settling basically for the annexation of the Donbass and a land bridge from Crimea through to Russia, along with Ukrainian commitment to neutrality and several other provisions. It's not 100% clear, whether that would in fact satisfy the Kremlin, and there's a bunch of obstacles to sealing that as an agreement. Nonetheless, we are moving towards a situation where the kind of agreement that both Branko and I support seems a bit more possible, and it seems to be downstream of Ukrainian military strength. So there is this question of what role Western military aid actually played in Ukraine's battlefield performance thus far, and I am, I don't have the authority to speak definitively on that. It seems to me from the reporting that I've seen that, Javelin and Stinger missiles, various forms of air defense have proven important in Ukraine's military success. I do think that even if one discounts the importance of specific military aid and weapons provisions since the invasion, if you consider that the Ukrainian defense forces have been built up for several years through Western military aid in the form of training operations and various forms of assistance since the 2014 invasion, I think it's hard to sustain that Western military aid has played no role in Ukraine's capacity to fend off this invasion. I think that those on Branko's side of the debate would argue that military aid itself is a cause of the war, that it was a provocation to Russia. And I think that's a serious argument. But I also think that, we kind of, none of us has access to the inner workings of Vladimir Putin's mind. And so I think we fundamentally cannot dismiss the possibility that, like other megalomaniacal leaders throughout history, including George W. Bush, Putin may have launched a regime change war in Ukraine out of offensive imperial ambitions rather than defensive security concerns. In which case it's possible that, had the West withheld military assistance since 2014, that Russia would control a great deal more of Ukraine, and perhaps even have managed to take over Kiev, which could have precipitated sort of the same protracted counterinsurgency war that we saw when our government took over Baghdad. And so, for these reasons, it just seems to me that it's not obvious that withholding military aid in Ukraine would either have been conducive to a settlement of the conflict that would have preserved Ukrainian territorial integrity, even over part of its territory, and nor is it clear to me that it would have advanced the goal of just peace, even if we stipulate that we're not that interested in Ukrainian nationalism. It seems to me that everything that we've seen so far indicates that Russia is not capable of commanding the legitimacy necessary to occupy Ukraine and establish peace and stability, that this would lead to counterinsurgency war. So there are other arguments that I made, but I think that this is the central point of contention between Branko and I, so I think I might leave off there.
Yeah, I guess it's my turn. I want to say I have a great deal of respect for Eric, and I love reading his stuff. I disagree pretty heavily with the argument he was making. I mean, my piece that was responding to this, the first thing we have to understand is that there's limits to what we can do. And so you can say the United States, the West, whatever. There's really profound limits. Just as with the Iraq War, when Bush invaded Iraq, there were limits to what could be done. And no one suggested, let's pour money into Iraq's security forces, let's give them weapons, let's try and train them, let's give them intelligence support to try and fight. No one suggested that because there was a real danger of the war, which was terrible and appalling, but it was not necessarily worth it to escalate the situation beyond what it was and potentially turn it into a wider confrontation, turn it into something that could end up being a nuclear war. It's a similar case here. My hesitance to support military aid, when I say military aid, I mean the lethal aid, the offensive aid, the tens of thousands of rifles, grenade launchers, grenades, missiles that are being just sent into the country, and are basically, from the sounds of it, being kind of distributed pretty indiscriminately, is that for the unclear benefit, and I'll explain why I think it's unclear, the unclear benefit of actually what that will bring, I think it does not weigh up to the potential risks, which are really serious and which, unfortunately, in US discourse around this war have not really been talked about at all. They've sort of been swept under the rug because they're very inconvenient to the kind of rah-rah jingoistic message that has been pushed for the US and other Western countries to intervene more forcefully in Ukraine. And just to be clear, I'm not saying Eric is doing a jingoistic argument, but that's kind of the climate right now. Number one, I'm sure the military aid has had some effect. I think it's also worth noting that apparently even US intelligence believed that Kiev was going to fall in 2 days, and it didn't. And there's big questions about why that didn't happen. Military aid is one answer. Of course, that's one that's going to be preferred by people who are in favor of that policy, or even further US military expansion or intervention in this conflict. But also there's the fact that, and this is not me saying it, this is a piece by William Arkin, veteran journalist in Newsweek, who talked to analysts working for the Pentagon and retired Air Force officers. They point out that, for instance, the Russian Air Force has not really been used throughout the war. It has a little bit, but not to the extent that you would imagine. Why is that? There's several different possible strategic reasons why they decide to do it, but it is just as likely that Putin miscalculated in some way, and that the Ukraine's surprising resistance is less to do with some of these things that the US has been doing, as helpful as they might have been, and more to do with a whole bunch of other factors, including some of those things that the US alleges, that Russian troops are low on morale, that they're confused and don't really know why they're there, they don't really want to be there, that they're working with faulty equipment, so on and so forth. Okay. But, like I said, I don't know. And we don't know, no one knows. I think it's going to be a long time before we actually know what exactly happened. But what are the risks? It's not as simple as just you send all these weapons into the country. Ukraine is able to be stronger against Russia. They fight them down to some sort of stalemate, and then a peace is reached, and that's it. Because those weapons don't disappear the moment a peace deal is reached, or some sort of ceasefire agreement is reached. Those weapons are still around. And there's the worrying issue of the fact that, of course, it can go on the black market and go God knows where, through Europe, potentially into Eastern Europe, who knows, maybe even into the Middle East. What that would cause, at this point, we can't say, but that's a very worrying thing. But there are also really Ukraine-specific concerns about what it means to just flood the country with weapons, and the Ukrainian far right is the most worrying thing. At the moment, there's this because Putin used this pretext of denazification to justify the invasion. Because that's such a big part of Russian propaganda in the West now, there is this wholesale kind of attempt to either just never talk about this issue, or actually to I've now started seeing reporting that's kind of playing down, the importance or the power, the influence, or even the radicalism of the Ukrainian far right. But Ukraine has had a serious far right problem for a very long time. There's not just the Azov regiment, which is part of the National Guard, but there's all sorts of right-wing militias, militias that are white supremacists. They're anti-democratic. They view their path to power as going through violent means. And you have to remember that they did manage in part to do this once. The 2014 revolution, the Maidan revolution, it was overwhelmingly pro-Western liberal Ukrainians who were driving that protest movement. And they were concerned about issues like corruption and authoritarianism. But that protest was also in many ways hijacked. And if you go back and look at Western reporting from even US government funded outlets before, 2021, 2020, they all say this openly, which is that the far right did have a really important role in those protests. And the kind of crucial moment where that Yanukovych, the president, decided to flee was basically when they had come up with a political settlement with the opposition. The opposition went back to the Maidan protesters, and the protesters were not happy about this. And an ultranationalist, one of the ultranationalist leaders, he came up on stage and he said, basically, if Yanukovych is not out of here by tomorrow morning, we are going to storm the presidential palace, we're going to storm parliament, and we're going to take him out. And he got the hell out of there. So they succeeded at doing this once. In the successive years after that, the Ukrainian far right people always point to the modest electoral success of the far right to say, so there isn't a problem in Ukraine. That's not really how it's measured or how you should measure the influence of the far right in Ukraine. They are a very militant and well-organized activist movement. They regularly resort to street violence to get their way. And they've been pretty successful at shifting the political center in Ukraine into a more ultranationalist direction, with the government passing things that kind of glorify Nazi collaborators and discriminating against Russian speakers in Ukraine. For instance, when Petro Poroshenko in 2015 tried to implement part of the Minsk Accords, which were agreed to as a solution to the fighting in the east, in the Donbass, what happened was there was a massive protest outside Parliament. The far right staged this confrontation. There were grenades being thrown in. I believe 3 police officers or 3 security members were killed in that scuffle. And basically, from there until this very war, the far right has consistently said, basically, whether it's Poroshenko or Zelensky, who, by the way, ran and won an insane mandate on a peace platform. They have said if anyone tries to implement some sort of peace, which they regard as a capitulation to Russia, we will, they'll pay for it with their life. We will attack them. And that wasn't the last time Poroshenko was attacked. Zelensky himself has been threatened by these far-right figures. I think a few days before the war was launched, even the New York Times said, Zelensky's in a bit of a difficult position here because the far right that are the most effective fighting force against the Russians. They're also a double-edged sword because what they could end up doing as well is overthrowing his government if they decide that the peace he settles on isn't acceptable. So this is what the New York Times was saying, just a few days before the conflict. Now, my question is, what happens when there are weapons just spreading through the country, thousands upon thousands of weapons? Some of those are going to disappear to the black market. They're going to make their way into basically any Ukrainians willing to fight into their hands. What does that mean for these far-right militias? What does it mean for the future democratic prospects of Ukraine if suddenly there is a better armed and actually battle-hardened ultra-nationalist bloc that's willing to use violence, that's willing to overthrow the government by force if need be, and that views any sort of peace with Russia as a capitulation? What does that mean for what could happen in the coming months, years? What does it mean for the vulnerable groups who are targets of violence and harassment by these far-right militias? The LGBTQ community, the Roma community. We don't know. We don't know what that's going to lead to. And the thing I always think about is it's that infamous Zbigniew Brzezinski quote from is it the late 80s or the no, it would have been sometime in the 90s when he justified the US equipping and funding and training the Mujahideen in the 80s in Afghanistan against the Soviets. And the quote was, and I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but it was, what's more important, the liberation of Europe and the end of the Cold War, or a few stirred up Muslims somewhere in the Middle East? And of course, those words became very, very tragically ironic less than a decade later, when, of course, those stirred up Muslims ended up carrying out the worst attack on US soil in the form of September 11. And we have to remember that the far right in Ukraine was long before this war, kind of an epicenter for far right organizing all over the world, including from the US. There were American extremists who were inspired by Azov, who went over to Ukraine to make contacts, to get training, that kind of thing. I think we're not nearly close to the end of what this war is, and we don't know how it's going to go. But I think we have to remember the failure of all of us to be able to see, years and decades into the future, and what it might mean, to side, even if it's indirectly, to tacitly side and support violent extremists now out of temporary convenience, that can become a very untemporary inconvenience later on. And I'll just say, in terms of what whether the military aid has helped to kind of strengthen Ukraine's hand. I mean, Russia's military aims certainly have changed. They seem to be stepping back from the regime change goal. I don't know if that's going to stick. We'll see. I hope it does. But I think it's also worth noting that in terms of the actual negotiating demands, Ukraine has successfully given more. Ukraine at first was unwilling to budge on the NATO issue. Zelensky a week or two ago said, you know what, NATO's not going to happen, and we're happy to talk about neutralization. Zelensky also was pretty firm on not acknowledging any of Russia's territorial demands. The other day, he said that he was willing to compromise in the Donbass, and he sort of walked it back. But it does seem like, military aims have changed, but the negotiating demands, Ukraine seems to be giving more and more, at least as it stands now, as this war goes on. So I think that's also worth going into. But yeah, I think the risk to both American life and the risk to Ukrainians, the stability of Ukraine, the stability of the entire region, I think could be really upended by just sort of continuing to pour military aid in there. And I think we have to grapple with this fact if we are going to make a case for sending these weapons into the country.
So I'll say up front that I think that in Branko's response to me, I think the strongest point which he sort of referenced at the end there, I failed to acknowledge the existence, of Ukraine's far right in my piece, and I do think that was a genuine oversight, and I take his argument very seriously, and I guess my general I'm still navigating trying to navigate this situation with humility as someone who is by no means a expert on this region or this nation. But I guess I have sort of some questions about, Branko's argument. So I think that there's just a little bit of a disconnect in the analogy with Afghanistan, right, where the direct object of our aid and the agent that we were empowering in a conflict were directly the extremists themselves, the Mujahideen, whereas here we are arming a sovereign, legitimate government that has within its defense forces a prominent but fundamentally very small minority that are comprised of far right militias. So I think this is an important distinction because it complicates, I think, the implications that this arming policy potentially has. At least, it seems to me, at least, it's not obvious to me that arming the Ukrainian government and its formal military would strengthen the nation's far right. In my understanding, the Azov battalion and other far-right militias that comprise a tiny fraction of the Ukraine. And I understand that they comprise a tiny fraction of Ukraine's defense forces. And it's also my understanding that, part of why Azov played such an outsized role in Ukraine's defense following Putin's 2014 invasion, and why they were incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard, was in part because the nation's formal military was weak. And there was the reason why the Ukrainian government felt compelled and does feel compelled to rely on and cooperate with fighters who, in Branko's own account, pose a threat to its own leadership, pose a threat to, Zelensky, is because of the limits of the state's formal military capacity. So it therefore seems at least possible to me that strengthening the formal military would reduce the leverage that far-right militias can exercise over Kiev, while also increasing the central government's capacity to crack down on the far-right militias in a post-war situation. And sort of separately from that, I believe that some of the heaviest fighting thus far and heaviest Ukrainian casualties have been concentrated in Mariupol, where the Azov battalion or regiment is concentrated. And so it at least seems possible to me that the percentage of Ukraine's, or rather that, Ukraine's neo-Nazi defenders are dying at a much higher rate than its non-far-right militia military, and thus becoming a smaller sort of fraction of its forces. And so I think that there's at least potentially that Putin's partial denazification of Ukraine might actually mitigate the problem that Branko raises. I guess the other issue here is that it's just not clear to me what the counterfactual is. I mean, I think that it's a problem for every argument, maybe, for all sides in this argument and in this conflict. It's such a difficult situation that it's hard to see what the alternative that is really plausible and that is acceptable is. But, if we choke off all military aid to Ukraine, so as to deny weapons to its far-right members, what happens? Ukraine, has fascistic militias within its National Guard, but I think Russia's government, currently, especially this wartime regime, bears no small number of similarities to fascist regimes historically. LGBT Ukrainians will not live well if their lives are shadowed by the Azov battalion, but they wouldn't live well under Putinism either. And then, separately, it seems to me that in a scenario where Kiev fell, where Ukraine's sovereign government, fell, and far-right militias became sort of the locus of resistance to a reviled sort of Russian puppet regime, that the far-right might actually thrive under that scenario as well. It also seems to me that before all this started, before weapons entered the country, that I would imagine that these far-right militants were among the most well-armed Ukrainians in the country. So it's not obvious to me that the net effect of this military aid is to strengthen the relative power of the Ukrainian far-right, their power relative to the rest of Ukrainian society and the Ukrainian government. It seems plausible to me. Don't get me wrong, but I guess I'm not. It's not clear to me that is what the implication would be. I will say separately that I do have my own concerns about the implications of arming Ukraine that include the one that Branko has emphasized with the far right, as well as this question of it seems like territorial concessions are going to be a precondition for any agreement that Putin is going to accept. It seems to me that not really plausible that Ukraine can drive Russian forces out of the Donbass, and there's really staunch resistance to that within Ukrainian society. And so the question of whether or not in maintaining Ukraine's capacities militarily, does that sort of solidify intransigence that makes this deal impossible? That is something that concerns me, because I think, all else equal, very much think that, for all its faults, the, fledgling form of capitalist democracy, however corrupt and with authoritarian tendencies and nationalist ones, Ukraine is. It is a less unfree form of government than Putinism. So I would like to see Ukraine maintain as much sovereignty as it can. At the same time, I think peace, war is hell, and I think that expediting the return of peace should be the number one objective here. And it's just not clear to me what actual policy course is conducive to that. And to that point, there was just one other thing that I wanted to raise, because it's a question that that I'm curious what Branko thinks on, and I'm not fully settled on it myself. But it seems to me when I'm reading about the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, it seems to me that there has been progress. Ukraine has offered to forswear NATO membership, has expressed comfort with committing to neutrality between Russia and the West, so not involving itself in their conflicts, not hosting foreign military bases, etc., among other things. But what, in every report that I've seen, an absolute precondition for those concessions from the Ukrainian government has been the receipt of security guarantees from third-party powers, generally from Western powers. And it's often viewed as like a consortium of like Turkey, China, Germany, France, and the U.S. or something, all saying that they will, basically making a commitment that if in the event of future aggression against Ukraine, we will come to its defense. And this is a real sticking point for Ukraine, I think, understandably, because their experience in 2014 is when Russia comes and conquers part of your territory, there's a very good chance that they're going to build up their forces over a period of years and come and conquer more of your territory. And if you do concede the Donbass and move the border between Russia, and the Ukrainian capital closer, you move that border westward. If you make peace after Russia has decimated the Ukrainian military-industrial base, you're kind of setting yourself up potentially to be reinvaded within a few years. And that is, it's already a difficult challenge that Zelensky has, selling concessions to the Ukrainian people in terms of territory especially. And so it's been really emphasized that the way that he believes he can sell that is with pairing this, okay, we give this up, but that's the end of it. We have these security guarantees that ensure that Russia is not going to reinvade. So that seems like critical to a deal, yet it also effectively means the U.S. committing to confrontation with a nuclear superpower in the event that it invades Ukraine in the future. And so I'm wondering, whether Branko supports the extension of such security guarantees, and if not, how do we imagine, peace and an agreement being reached here? Because I have trouble seeing it.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me deal with the some of the points brought up about the far right. For one, I mentioned the Maidan Revolution, where the far right were using kind of hunting rifles and other kind of relatively low-level weapons. I mentioned the incident outside of the Ukrainian parliament where grenades were thrown, or a grenade was thrown. Now, imagine if those confrontations, instead of those weapons, you had militias armed with actual assault rifles and grenade launchers and missiles. I mean, I think this is what we have to, and copious grenades. As far as whether Azov is eliminated, I have no idea, because there's a lot of stuff that is just said out there about this war that doesn't end up coming true. That may well be true, but the Azov regiment was part of a wider movement. The Azov regiment was the only far-right militia integrated into the Ukrainian National Guard, but it's not the only far-right militia out there, and nor is it the sort of the be-all and end-all of the wider Azov movement. There are others out there. In terms of if the state could end up better putting down or cracking down on these groups, there's really serious reasons to doubt that. For one, I mean, the fact that the Azov regiment were brought into the actual official security forces of Ukraine gives you a hint about how the members of the Ukrainian government, not all of them, but are not necessarily unsympathetic to some of these far-right groups, or at the very least, they see them as being able to control them. The Interior Minister, Arsen Avakov, he was the one who brought them in because he was kind of allied with them. And he believed that they were kind of the key to his political rise. There has been reports for a long time in Ukraine that when far-right groups attack LGBTQ protests, the Roma people, others, when they disrupt city council meetings, or they attack left-wing organizing meetings, so on and so forth, the police don't end up doing anything. And one thing to note is that pre-war, there were ultra-nationalists who were part of the Ukrainian police hierarchy in key posts. But police didn't always actually end up arresting or doing anything to the far-right militias. They sometimes would actually arrest the people being attacked. It's not, I don't think it's quite as simple as thinking, well, now that there's more guns in Ukraine, and a lot of those guns, Ukraine is one of the biggest arms trafficking black holes in Europe. So those guns that have just been sent in there, a lot of them are going to disappear and end up somewhere else in the hands of other people. Also, the fact that Zelensky himself said, I'm giving guns to every man, woman, and child who wants to fight, doesn't exactly suggest that they have been kind of, they're doing background checks on every single person before they hand out some of these things. So I think all that's worth remembering. I think it's also worth remembering that the US, in sending these weapons and basically urging other countries or goading other countries to do the same, it's not doing it with the aim of allowing Ukraine to win. The explicit aim, and one of my big disagreements with Eric's piece is he treats this as a kind of hypothetical, as a kind of a trick for, I guess, myself or people on the left to kind of avoid dealing with some of the messy realities of the war. But in fact, it's not a hypothetical. This is a real strategy that is actually existing among US officials. They want to turn Ukraine into what Afghanistan was for the Soviets in the 80s, what Vietnam was for the United States in the 60s and 70s. They couldn't care less. I'm very sorry to tell everyone, but the people in the Biden administration could not care less about Ukrainians. What they want is they want to draw Russia into a protracted conflict that, even if Russia has a superior military force, if they are constantly having people being killed by a guerrilla insurgency that lasts years and years and years, that hopefully will end up destabilizing the country or weaken it so that they can then confront China without having a united Russian and Chinese front. And I think also potentially, maybe not the explicit goal, although I would urge people to read the piece that Niall Ferguson wrote for Bloomberg, where he quotes a senior administration official, quote unquote, explicitly saying that they hope that, ultimately what's going to happen is Putin gets thrown out. But that is also another ancillary, aim of this whole thing. We have to remember that the people running foreign policy, particularly in the United States, but in a lot of Western countries where foreign policy, the national security state is taken out of democratic hands, and it's basically just decided on by a small elite in rooms, they have very different interests than the kind of humanitarian ones that, quite justifiably animate all of us here. And I think most ordinary people, they have something else going. And I think at this point, if you read the reporting since December, if you read, there was that David Sanger piece in the New York Times last week, I think it's not really tenable to say that this is just a hypothetical, that the US isn't explicitly trying to make this happen. Now, what can be done instead? My preference is not to have, Russia lording over a puppet regime in Kiev. I don't think that's anyone's preference. But again, because of the real dangers of just sending arms into this, the potential for destabilization in the near future in Ukraine, we have to do something else. And the thing that I have put forward, the thing that others keep calling for, including Zelensky himself, is the US, and not just the US, but the US needs to enter these negotiations. Unless we basically just go for the complete destruction of Ukraine, this war, like every war, is going to end with people in a room across a table from each other talking. And that is happening now between Russia and Ukraine, but it is not happening with US officials. And that's a mistake, both because US officials, whatever you think about the sanctions, they've imposed the sanctions. They are the ones who control the lever there. They're also, even though they're not directly fighting, even though Washington is not directly fighting this war, they are militarily intervening in the country. And so they should be party to these negotiations, as should NATO. Because if you are going to create some sort of stable security arrangement, I don't know what exactly that would look like, but if you're going to create one, you have to have those countries there, negotiating and talking about what that actually looks like. I think also China should enter. China's not involved in this war as the US and NATO are, but China is sticking by its kind of alliance, friendship, whatever you want to call it, with Russia. It is kind of the larger, in the same way that the US is the larger power behind NATO, China is kind of the larger power behind Russia. It makes sense for them to come in and to be able to sort of broker some sort of deal. In terms of the specifics of that, I cannot tell you what at least off the cuff here, what a stable security arrangement is going to look like. That's going to be something that has to be decided by all those people in a room figuring out something that works for everyone. But I think that's what needs to be done. There is no real, unfortunately, no real pressure on the Biden administration to come into these negotiations at all. The media is either, why aren't you implementing a no-fly zone? Were you too quick to rule out World War III? Were you too quick to rule out nuclear holocaust? Or it's the kind of more soft military intervention. Let's send weapons in. I think there needs to be far more of a stress on diplomacy. I'm not the only one. Veteran diplomats and other foreign policy experts are out there. They've been saying this for a while. The only way this is going to end is through a settlement. The US should enter these negotiations. I think in terms of, again, what a security arrangement looks like post-fact, whether I'd be comfortable with the United States coming in to fight on behalf of Ukraine if Russia invaded again, I think that would be quite dangerous and potentially very disastrous. I don't know if that's the security arrangement that has to be done. There's for instance, Vladimir Yashchenko, he's a Ukrainian analyst, and he's not the only one. They've suggested, what about, speeding up Ukraine's entry into the EU, give Zelensky some sort of win that he can point to his own population. And of course, that would have to be paired with a lot of economic aid, and not IMF loans, not payday loans, basically to bleed Ukraine, the Ukrainian population, but rather actual economic aid that rebuilds it in the same way that Germany was rebuilt after the Second World War. So that's sort of those are my responses, I guess, to what Eric was saying.
Yeah, I just want to say that I agree with. If I had the power, the United States would delegate the authority to, or rather, the West more broadly would delegate the authority to lift sanctions to the Zelensky government in negotiations. I do think that there is more that the U.S. could be doing to abet a peace agreement, and I would agree that the responsibility of Americans in general and the American left in particular is to pressure our government to do what is conducive to peace. I do think that to be effective in that role requires really trying to navigate and engage with where mainstream opinion is, and recognize sort of these complexities that I have been pointing to. I think that I will say that I just regarded the idea of the U.S. turning Ukraine into Afghanistan as a hypothetical, in the sense that Kiev's fall and what the U.S. should do in the event that we're arming an insurgency is the opposition to Russia and Ukraine rather than the sovereign government, remains a hypothetical scenario. I do think that U.S. policy was preparing for that because, as Branko suggested, the Pentagon did not think that Ukraine was going to hold out as well as it did. I agree that the U.S. its imperative is not the well-being of the Ukrainian people, and its lack of concern in that regard, has contributed, to a degree that it's impossible for us to determine because of what we don't know, but seems to me to have contributed to the disaster that we currently have. At the same time, I think that it was just not within the last decade, the U.S. was looking to have a reset with Russia so as to counterbalance against China. It's not generally as a part of America's broad grand strategy. Opposition to Russia is not, the central goal there, and that opposition has fundamentally, in my view, become more prominent due to Russia's own decision to begin, to respond to, the Maidan with an invasion of Ukraine, and that is sort of what has soured U.S.-Russia relations to the point where, we're now at this juncture. And so it is not clear to me to what extent the U.S.'s affirmative policy goal at this point is to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian, to bleed out Russia's resources, and to what extent that was sort of the game plan when the presumption was that the Ukrainian government was going to fall. And now it's sort of in this more ambiguous territory because the U.S. is confronting a situation that it did not anticipate. But Branko's point that the U.S. security state's motives are not purely humanitarian is certainly well taken.
So I'm to offer a question that maybe pivots and wraps up the conversation. It seems like there's two things going on. On the one hand, a lot of what you guys have been talking about so far is dealing with getting an accurate analysis of the situation, of the interests involved, so that we can get a better sense of the possible outcomes. But then there's also, this question of what the left's response should be to what's going on. That seems like the debate really started with what the left's response should be so far. And that's how I've understood why you both have been discussing what's actually been going on. That it should be informed, our actual response should be informed by what's going on. But as we all know, the American left is virtually powerless. We do some ideological prodding and poking here and there, but the world really isn't made up of good ideas, it's made up of power. So the left doesn't really influence what's going on in any major way. Maybe a different way to put that is that the elites of the world, the various ruling classes, the American ruling class, the Western ruling classes, the Russian ruling class, the Chinese ruling class, they're all going to find solutions to this situation and others that fit more or less within their interests. So is the point of this debate that we're having is it, on the one hand, what is a better left strategy to influence the outcome of the war? Or is it, on the other hand, is it how do we have a greater understanding of these social dynamics of war, of sovereignty, etc., how to resolve these conflicts so that if the left is in a position of power, we can have better political solutions that lead to more democratic and egalitarian outcomes?
I'll go first. I think both. I think on the one hand, I think one day, God willing, the left will have more power in this country and everywhere around the world. And these are thorny questions that we'll have to confront. And when we make the decisions that we make, they'll actually matter instead of just sort of being a theoretical thing. And I think it is worth thinking about this issue. I understand this, the drive to, we want to help them militarily. There's a sovereign country that's being invaded by a larger neighbor. The stuff we're seeing is horrendous, of course. That you would not be a human being if you didn't have that response. But this has always been the trouble with liberal interventionism, which is it's driven by emotion and not always driven by thinking about the practicalities on the ground. And that we saw so many times this has led to disaster. The Libya misadventure is one of the clearest cases, but you could go through so many others. So I think, as I said in the piece, I don't believe in pacifism in every single instance, no matter what. However, I am very keenly aware of, both because of the realities of Ukraine, which most people are very uninformed about. They just have a very surface level good guy versus bad guy idea of what's going on over there. Because people are, not because of the realities of Ukraine, but also because of the very well documented history of how military solutions, like sending military aid, like sending weapons and so forth into a country, can lead to long-term consequences. I oppose it here, and I think this is the kind of analysis that the left should bring, when, God willing, they have power sometime in the future. Beyond that, I, as a journalist, obviously I write for people who are, lean politically in a certain direction, but I hope that to some extent, what I put out there has a bit more of an influence in some of the discourse. As I said, right now, the entire pressure on the Biden administration is just to do more militarily. There's absolutely no the stuff I'm saying and the stuff some of the other left commentators that Eric pointed to are saying gets almost next to no purchase at all in mainstream discourse. And I think that's kind of dangerous because if the only pressure is for the US to get more and more military involved, to draw red lines, then it's going to bend to that pressure. I would hope that there are other commentators, there are other people, if they are interested in helping Ukraine, they rather than going to protests where they're calling for a no-fly zone, they go to protests outside the White House, demanding that Biden enter negotiations, that he do something about this ceasefire deal. Remember that in his State of the Union speech, there was no mention of ceasefire. And I believe he actually, whether it was in that speech or sometime else, he said, this is going to take a long, long time. That is very worrying to me. And I think the best thing for Ukrainians, if we actually care about them, is not to have this be a protracted war. It should be to try and find a solution as quickly as possible. And part of that solution, I think, rests in having the US into negotiations. So, if anyone's listening to this, pressure your congressperson. Democracy is very limited in the United States. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It doesn't mean that popular pressure can't do anything. I think that's a better use of our energies, whether you're, a socialist, progressive, liberal, whatever. That's a better use of our energies than just sort of calling for more military solutions. And also, we should transition away from fossil fuels. That's my last of all. If there's nothing else that this should teach us, we're getting a very visceral look at how if you sit on a giant reserve of oil and gas, you at the very least have a perception of yourself as being able to act in a variety of kind of outrageous ways, because you have this very powerful piece of leverage over the international community, quote unquote. So let's really use this moment to aggressively invest away from fossil fuels and change our energy system, and hopefully not all die in a climate apocalypse.
I would second a lot of what Branko said there at the end. I also think that it is more useful to, I don't think that arming Ukraine needs any more, that objective needs more support than it already has. Whereas I think that pressure on the Biden administration to not seek, not encourage, not seek a maximalist sort of agenda here, but try to facilitate peace. We need more voices calling for that, absolutely, as well as voices calling to forgive Ukraine's foreign debt and increase refugee admissions. I think that's the left's role is in the current context. I think is primarily to agitate for those things. I think that it's just important, given the opinion climate that we have, to really take seriously majoritarian sentiment on other aspects of the conflict in order for arguments along those lines to be heard and received with open minds. As far as does any of this stuff that we do matter, or are we just people who like to think about the world and argue, and so we do that, and we found a way to get paid a little bit for it, and I think we all probably have that existential moment of the soul. But I do think that it is a fact that Joe Biden, no one's idea, at least a few years ago, of a dove withdrew U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And in fact, the last two U.S. presidents, really the last three, were elected on kind of anti-interventionist platforms. I don't think that, one can credit the left in the broadest sense for that exclusively, let alone the left in the narrow sense of the socialist left. Nonetheless, I think that there was a real role played there. And, the fact is that the people who staff the Biden administration, increasingly the rising generation of them, are, overlapping. Their media ecosystem and media diet overlaps with that of the left's, and they do confront these arguments. And I do think there is a broad, in addition to the funding of institutions, like the Quincy Institute or whatever, there are more non-interventionist voices that have an ear in the Democratic Party, and perhaps maybe I'm skeptical, but perhaps the post-Trump Republican Party. I don't think it's all totally pointless. I think that the discourse, there is a little bit of sort of elite suasion that can be done within certain very limited bounds. And then besides that, I think just sharpening the left's sort of internal sort of intellectual strength and health is a goal in itself. Especially since I think that it really is a very difficult and unintuitive landscape that we confront right now. There is no international socialist or workers' movement with any significant power. There isn't a, the chief rivals to American imperial power are both, fundamentally they're state capitalist. They are, if anything, more hostile to organized labor than the United States. So that it's just not obvious what the position in many of these emerging conflicts that are going to define, the next few decades. It's not going to be intuitive to people who broadly sympathize with the left where their values are supposed to bring them in those conflicts. And I think it's just important to have a really sort of open and vigorous debate about that stuff, so that we have both clear thinking and sharp arguments, even when we internally disagree.
Okay, well, I think we can probably end it there. Thank you both to Eric Levitz and to Branko Marcetic, probably two of our finest and most insightful journalists working today. So
thank you.
Thank you both for your time.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.